It is a wonderful honor to welcome Joseph Pearce on this program. He is the visiting professor of literature at Ave Maria University, and we're here to discuss the great author G.K. Chesterton. There's a course which Professor Pearce uh, taught in the Pursuit of Wisdom website on Ave Maria University about the wisdom of Chesterton, and we're here to discuss all about that. Joseph, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's begin by talking about your personal conversion to Catholicism and how that may parallel with the conversion of Chesterton himself.
Yes, well, I always say that under grace, I owe more to G.K. Chesterton than anybody for my own conversion. Chesterton was, of course, a convert, as am I. As a young man, was very an angry political radical who was not a Christian, antagonistic to aspects of Christianity, and not interested in reading any books by Christians about Christianity. But I was interested in politics, as I've said, and economics. So someone said to me, well, have you looked at the distributist political ideas of G.K. Chesterton? And I hadn't. But I bought a book by Chesterton called The Well and the Shallows for one particular essay in it, which was on economics. But the rest of the book was basically a defense of the Catholic faith. The title is The Well and the Shallows. The well is something which is deep, profound, offers life-giving water, and everything else. That's the Catholic Church. Everything else is the shallows by comparison. So I wasn't converted overnight by any means, but I got to like Chesterton's writing style, his way of thinking, his use of paradox, his sense of humor, his goodness. And so I started reading more and more Chesterton. And, for a long while, I thought you could separate Chesterton's political wisdom from his Catholic theology. And of course, I came to realize in the end that his political wisdom was a consequence of his Catholic theology and that you couldn't separate them. And this was the beginning of my own journey to conversion, which is why my biography of Chesterton, which is my first book as a Catholic, I call it an act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, but also an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So with that, tell us about the story of Chesterton's own conversion.
Yeah, so one thing I do have in common with Chesterton, both of us took a bit of a time to actually to formalize our love for the church by being received into the church. In my case, the whole of the 1980s. I first read Chesterton about 1980 and was received in the church in 1989. Chesterton was essentially a Catholic from at least 1908 when he wrote Orthodoxy, but would not actually be received in the church for a further 14 years in 1922. And the reason for that is this obviously this monumental, life-changing step to cross the threshold into the Catholic Church was something he didn't want to do without his wife taking the same step with him at the same time. And she resisted. She was quite comfortable being an Anglican. So he delayed and delayed and delayed. And in the end, I think his conscience just got the better of him. And he took that momentous step by himself without his wife. But thankfully, a year or two later, she followed him into the church.
If any of you are watching by video, I can see on your video feed there are two posters. One on the left side, as far as I can see, there's a quotation by J.R.R. Tolkien, and on the right side, there's one by Chesterton. So since we're talking about Chesterton, why don't you tell us about the poster and the quotation?
Yeah, so quite a few years ago, I was giving a talk at I think it was the University of Illinois at Champaign in Illinois, and the Newman Center is the Catholic Center for Catholic Students there. And there was a student there who was a very good artist, and she designed several posters. These are two of them. She also did one on Flannery O'Connor, and there's a fourth. I can't remember what the fourth one was. So yeah, so the Tolkien one says, out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves on earth, which is a marvelous uh, defense of the Blessed Sacrament by Tolkien. And the Chesterton one says, men do not differ much about what things they will call evils. They differ enormously about what evils they will call excusable. So that's the Chesterton quote there.
Wow. Yeah. So like you, I am also a convert to the Catholic faith. I think this year will mark my second year in the church. So actually my third. I converted in 2022. So it was a very recent one. I'd say the two great figures that draw me into the faith are William F. Buckley Jr. and Thomas Aquinas. I guess two somewhat different figures. But I think what they signify to me is that there's a certain sophistication in being a Catholic thinker that I frankly rarely find in either secular thinkers when they talk about religion or um, Christian thinkers of various Protestant denominations when they're talking about Christianity. And I do find that, within Chesterton's milieu, the Catholic literary slash philosophical tradition in England contains a wide variety of figures. We have, of course, Chesterton himself, but also Belloc, Tolkien, uh, Waugh, Jared Manley Hopkins, and of course, Cardinal Newman. So tell us about this unique literary slash philosophical scene that burst out in the 19th and 20th century on the British Isles.
Yes, I'd be delighted to do so. First of all, however, I want to congratulate you on your reception into Holy Mother Church. Welcome home. It's obviously the most important decision any of us can make is to be received into the mystical body of Jesus Christ, which is the Catholic Church. So welcome. I say a convert, but I've been around. I've been a convert for much longer than you. So 1989. So I'm much older. So yes, my second book. When I was writing my book on Chesterton, my biography of Chesterton, it dawned on me first of all how many people Chesterton had influenced that also converted. So this got me interested in the Catholic literary and cultural revival. So my second book after I became a Catholic was called Literary Converts, and it was a study of the Catholic revival in the 20th century. So it begins in 1900 with the deathbed conversion of Oscar Wilde, and then ends in 1990 with the death of Graham Greene. So it's history of the 20th century. I read it at the end of the 20th century, but that actually was a bit of a strange place to start, because as you rightly say, this revival began earlier than that in the 19th century. It really began with the English Romanticism and its reaction against the scientism and empiricism and philosophical materialism of the Enlightenment, and a rediscovery of beauty as a means to truth, but also a rediscovery of the Middle Ages. So one manifestation of Romanticism in the English-speaking world were three distinct manifestations of neo-medievalism, rediscovering the Middle Ages. One was the Gothic revival in architecture. So many of the new Catholic churches that were being built in England following Catholic emancipation in 1829 were built in this neo-Gothic style. So we have the Gothic revival in architecture, the leader of whom, Augustus Pugin, was a convert to the faith. And his most famous building, for those that don't know, if you go to London, are the Houses of Parliament. He was the architect for the Houses of Parliament, which are, they look as if they're as old as Westminster Abbey, on the other side of the road, which is medieval, but they're actually 19th century neo-Gothic revival. The second were the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So this is a movement in the visual arts and poetry, but especially the visual arts, which again leapfrogged over the whole period of the post-Enlightenment, post-Renaissance and late Renaissance, and rediscovered the purity of medieval and early Renaissance art pre-Raphael, pre the artist Raphael. That's why they're pre-Raphaelites. And the third, and perhaps from the perspective of the Catholic revival, the most important, was the Oxford movement within the Church of England, of which John Henry Newman was the leader, and that again leapfrogged over the whole period of the Reformation and tried to regraft the English church back onto the medieval English church. When Newman's historical researches and theological researches led him to the conclusion that the Anglican Church was not part of that, was not a continuation of that medieval Catholic Church in England, he did the only logical and theological thing he could, and that was to convert to Catholicism. And his conversion was really, that's what really kick-started the Catholic revival. 1845, Newman's conversion. All of these neo-medievalist movements had been paving the way, but Newman's conversion was the definitive, should we say, starting point of the birth, if you like, of the Catholic cultural and literary revival. So it really dates back, and it's what I sometimes call the gestation period, is from 1798, the publication of a volume of poetry by Wordsworth and Coleridge, to 1845. That's the gestation period, and then 1845 to Newman's death in 1890 is the Newman period, and then the second major period is what I call the Chester-Belloc period, from 1900, when Chesterton is first published, to 1936, Chesterton's death, is the period of the Chester-Belloc, the period where Chesterton and Belloc are the leaders of this revival.
Now, tell me about their shared economic philosophy, which is distributism.
Yeah, so there's a new book out just recently published by the Chesterton Society called Localism. And I think, and I agree with this rebranding of distributism. So it's exactly the same idea, but the word distributism is a confusing word. Chesterton himself said it was an ugly word, and many people think distributism means the redistribution of wealth. In other words, socialism, and that's not what Chesterton and Belloc were advocating. What they were advocating essentially was what the Catholic Church's social teaching has made manifest in England in the works of and life of Cardinal Manning, but also and especially the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891. So what Belloc and Chesterton were doing was making manifest and popular the Church's social teaching. And essentially what it is that, you know, that a healthy society is one where the economy is defined by large numbers of small businesses, not a small number of big businesses. In other words, that the entrepreneurship, private property in productive enterprises is something which is good and healthy for society. So therefore, you want as many small businesses as possible. So therefore, what militates against that is both big businesses that become monopolies or global corporations in modern terminology, but also big government. And it used to be, you know, people used to believe, 100 years ago, you had to choose between capitalism and socialism. You had to choose between big business or big government. But as we see now in the 21st century, that big government and big business go hand in hand. They like each other. The bigger businesses, the global corporations, like to work with global political institutions or big governments that have power. So this militates against not just small business, but against small government. So that's why distributism can be seen as localism. We need the revitalization, the reinvigoration, not just of local small business, but also local small government.
So this may be an obvious question, but I'm sure there's a connection between distributism as an economic principle and subsidiarity as a sort of like a social government principle.
Exactly. In fact, subsidiarity was one of the two pillars of Catholic social teaching laid out by Leo XIII. The other was solidarity. So basic solidarity is that we have to be aware to love the Lord thy God, to love thy neighbor. To love thy neighbor means you have to be aware of the common good, right? So radical individualism, where we're just pursuing our own selfish interests, is not an option. But against the danger of that common good becoming big government, in particular, the ideas of communism or socialism in the name of justice or equality, you have to have this huge government that takes over the means of production. As opposed to that, subsidiarity demands, on the contrary, that power should be devolved up from localities towards centralities and not the other way around, where power is imposed by a big central government on localities. And the most important locality, most important local government is the human family. So basically the center of all political life should be human families, and power should be devolved up from them to local communities, then from local communities to regional communities, then regional communities to national communities, but the power's been devolved up, and the national government should not be involved in anything that can be done at local level. If things can be done at local level, at family level, then we have to ensure that there's a freedom to do that, and the central government should only really be involved with things that have to be done on such a scale for the common good that local government and individual families cannot do that for themselves.
Now back to Chesterton. So for both of us who are Catholics and for the listeners of this show who are Catholics, he is obviously a treasure. But what is the appeal of Chesterton to non-Catholics or non-Christians?
Yeah, so I think that for instance, C.S. Lewis, who really is, should we say, for the Protestant world, what we say Chesterton is for the Catholic world, that Lewis's conversion to Christianity was Chesterton was hugely responsible for that. So when Lewis first read Chesterton during the World War I, when he was serving in the British Army, he was an atheist and a cynic, but just like me, and I was an agnostic and a cynic towards religion. That he fell in love with Chesterton's personality, his goodness, his writing style, his sense of humor, and although he was an atheist, began reading Chesterton. So Chesterton has this power to evangelize, and then when Lewis read Chesterton's The Everlasting Man in 1925 or 1926, mid-1920s, shortly after it was published, he said that I saw the Christian outline of history laid out before me for the first time in a way that made sense. So this was a very important milestone on Lewis's progress to becoming a Christian. And then many Protestants and many evangelicals have been brought to Chesterton through C.S. Lewis. So they read C.S. Lewis, they read how much Lewis admires Chesterton, and that prompts them to then start reading Chesterton. So I think we see that what Chesterton calls orthodoxy, Lewis in some ways calls mere Christianity, and this idea of this highest common factor of what is Christian doctrine being a means to evangelize the culture is something which both Lewis and Chesterton have done very successfully and continue to do very successfully.
Now, I'll say, speaking on my personal experience as well as yours, I do remember before being accepted to the Catholic faith, I did have a rather firm skepticism towards religion. I was like reading all the new atheist authors. I'm sure they didn't exist around your time, but you had your text, I suppose. And I do notice that the more skeptical I am of organized religion, the more convinced I am of certain grand abstract political principles. And I see that amongst my younger peers as well. And I'm sure, speaking from your personal experience, you and your peers must have been the same way. And I think one thing that we both notice is that those who are the most convinced of the political ideals which they are subscribed to tend to be the most skeptical of organized religion. I wonder to what extent did Chesterton saw the same thing in his era?
Well, yes. So basically, Chesterton was raised as a lukewarm, vague Unitarian Christianity, and he came to the Catholic faith through an understanding that faith and reason, fides et ratio, were indissolubly wedded. They're married together, and you can't divorce them without losing both. If you lose faith in the supernatural reality of God, right, you then very quickly lose reason because of that. On the other hand, if you believe in a supernatural God but refuse to subject your understanding of that supernatural God to reason, then you end up believing all sorts of crazy supernatural ideas. So the two have to be held together. So my reading of Chesterton, for instance, was that I was raised, like many people, to believe you had to choose. You have to choose between being religious or being rational. You know, if you choose to be religious, you might get the comforts of religion, of those beliefs, but you only by abandoning your reason. Alternatively, you know, if you want to be truly rational, you have to abandon any pretense of at religion. And what I learned, of course, first of all through Chesterton, and then Belloc and C.S. Lewis, and eventually, as with you, discovering the great angelic doctor St. Thomas Aquinas and the ideas of Aristotle, which he's basically baptizing, that you come to see that that faith and reason, one is absolutely necessary for the other, and that they have to be, I say, they have to be one flesh. And once you understand that, then the whole thing, the whole cosmos begins to unlock. You begin to see deeper into the reality of things, but only once you understand this indissoluble union between fides et ratio, between faith and reason.
Yes, and of course, Lewis saw the same thing in the 20th century too, that once reason is divorced from faith, you end up in either of the two extremes. One is the over-reliance on reason as the means to explain everything on the planet. And secondly, you end up uh, being disillusioned by reason and you end up in unreason, say the postmodern movement, for example. Um, yeah, so how was reason used and I suppose abused during Chesterton's time?
Yeah, so you mentioned Lewis there. There's a wonderful book by Lewis, which most people, it's not one of his better known books, it's an early book by him. I think might have been even the first book he wrote uh, post conversion. It's called The Pilgrim's Regress, and it actually charts his progress from atheism, from the loss of faith, and then atheism, and then his return. And what that shows, you know, diagrammatically, visually, there's a straight path. The straight path towards truth and reason is the path of virtue. That if you don't keep to the path of virtue, the natural virtues, you will deviate also from reason. So that's the straight line, and then you can deviate to the north, which is hard-headedness, right? It's reason without it's the head without the heart, shall we say? The reason without the faith, and then, or you can deviate to the south, where it's all about feeling and emotions, and you follow your feelings and emotions to the divorcing that from your head. Both ways lead to madness of various sorts. You know, to the north, the rational side, you end up with the horrors of communism. Um, you know, the horrors of should we say militant atheism, when we've seen the way that's played itself out in history. And at the other extremes, you have the madness of subjectivism. You know, whether it's the ideas of Sigmund Freud or the ideas we have now of the woke people, that basically there is no reason, there's only will. So this is the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche and others, of course. So if there's no such thing as truth, there's only will, then it's all about self-empowerment. It's all about doing what you want to do, and there's no rational reason why anybody should stop you from doing it. So that's sort of madness to the south. So Lewis and Chesterton saw this. For instance, Chesterton said, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And that's what we find today, is that there's nothing so mad that there aren't people advocating it.
Yes. Yeah, I was thinking more about the concept of the man without chest in The Abolition of Man, Lewis's later works. Also an excellent short work of his. Um, yeah, so I suppose in the 19th century England, there's the current of the socialist thinkers. Think about someone like H.G. Wells, but there's also what I would say a hyper-capitalistic thinker. I think Herbert Spencer and the social Darwinist movement. I think both of them are extremes of one end or the other. And to that effect, Chesterton seems to be reacting against these extremes by promoting, I suppose, a healthy healthy base, faith-based reasoning in politics. So how does he manage to do this?
Yeah, well, again, coming back to that image of the straight path of virtue, natural virtue, being something that's necessary in order to keep ourselves connected to reason. Goodness being ultimately goodness, truth, and beauty. Those transcendentals we get from the Greeks initially, the understanding the good, true, and the beautiful. They are triune, right? They are a manifestation of the triune reality. That the fact that there's a Trinitarian part to things, because you can't separate goodness from truth, or truth from beauty. These things are some way are distinct and yet inseparable. So same thing, if you want to be true, if you want to be true to your reason, you also have to be good, right? You also have to be virtuous. So basically that's what Chesterton's doing. And Chesterton's doing is that, as you say, between these two extremes, his path of faith and reason, of ultimately Catholicism, is the via media. It's the middle path between extremes, which again we get from Aristotle, that basically the path of virtue is this via media, this middle path between the extremes. And so we do see that made manifest in Chesterton, who is himself merely making manifest the truth of the Catholic Church's teaching through St. Thomas Aquinas, who's basically baptizes Aristotle. So, this absolute understanding that goodness and truth and beauty are one. And if you try to separate any one of those three from each other, you end up with madness of one sort or another.
And how does Chesterton's writings provide a response or a rebuttal to, say, the moral hedonism of Oscar Wilde or D.H. Lawrence?
Yeah, well, again, that Chesterton rebuts Wilde from saying these people, they talk about beauty, the aesthetic movement, and then becomes the decadent movement. They talk about beauty, and yet they're very comfortable with ugliness. In other words, with the ugliness of sin, and there's a hypocrisy here. And what Chesterton goes back to there is, again, coming to it from Aquinas, that the only true engagement with aesthetics, with beauty, is through a sense of wonder. So to go back to the beginning, again, we come back to virtue, because it's the first step to understanding goodness, truth, and beauty is to have humility. And if you have humility, you will have a sense of gratitude. If you have a sense of gratitude, your eyes will be opened in wonder. And it's only when your eyes are open in wonder, you move to contemplation, contemplatio. And it's only once you reach this place of contemplation that you can experience dilatatio, dilation, the opening of the mind and the heart into the fullness of reality. This is what I sometimes call the five metaphysical senses. We have our five physical senses. The five metaphysical senses are inseparable, but also sequential. It goes in that order. You have to have humility, to have gratitude, to have wonder, to have contemplation, to have dilation. So that's the antidote to a false aesthetics, which leads to decadence.
Now, speaking of Aquinas, Chesterton wrote a biography, if you can call it, of the great Dominican friar. And in the first chapter, titled "The Two Friars," he compared Aquinas to the other great friar, Saint Francis of Assisi. And on the surface, I would not conclude that those two share many things in common. But yeah, what are some of the commonalities that Chesterton sees between these two great saints?
And again, this is Chesterton, the master of paradox, right? What you do, you bring together two apparent contradictions that appear to be contradictory, but you actually realize these apparent contradictions, the Franciscan and Dominican spirit, Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas in this case, how they actually point to a deeper truth. Go right back, and there was obviously tension between the Franciscans and the Dominicans in their relative approach when the orders first started. But again, even as early as Dante, who's a disciple of St. Thomas Aquinas, in Paradise, in Dante's Paradiso, in the Divine Comedy, he has St. Thomas Aquinas praising St. Francis, and he has St. Bonaventure, the great Franciscan, praising St. Dominic, the founder of the Dominicans. So Dante is saying, Dante the Thomist is basically saying that on the level of paradise, in other words, on the level of absolute truth and goodness, the Dominican spirit and the Franciscan spirit are one. So Chesterton approaches it, I think, again, by saying that Aquinas accentuates the necessity of reason, all right, of truth as approached via reason. Thomas, St. Francis and the Franciscan spirit accentuates, if you like, the love of God and creatures, humanity and the natural world. So what you might call accentuate the heart, right, over the head. But the key thing and the paradox is these things cannot be separated. And we do need to realize who's one of the greatest poets in the whole history of humanity? St. Thomas Aquinas, right? That the Corpus Christi sequence, which he wrote, is some of the most beautiful poetry in praise of the Blessed Sacrament ever written. So you have this man, yes, he's pursuing reason with an absolute precise approach to it. That's not going to be distracted by anything which is irrational, and yet he also understands beauty and has that sense of wonder, which allows him to that contemplation, which dilates into the beauty of his poetry, which we still use today at Corpus Christi.
Yes, and some of Thomas's greatest verses are in dedication to the Eucharist. And for me, pardon my newly accepted Catholic faith, but it took me a very long time to fully embrace and accept the trueness, the goodness, and the beauty of the Eucharist. And I can in some ways understand why the non-Catholic denominations they have a hard time accepting that the real presence is there, and but I see that they're kind of missing out on the wonder of it. So I guess tell me about the Eucharist and how Chesterton saw it.
So, I mean, Chesterton developed such a love for the Eucharist that he actually went to communion with great trepidation because what he called the tremendous reality of what the Eucharist is, the real presence of Jesus Christ. We should say, that it's rather singular that the Protestants that insist upon sola scriptura, right? It's the word in Scripture, and particularly and especially the words of the gospel, and particularly especially the words of Jesus Christ himself that we have to take literally. We have to take what he says. And there's nowhere in the gospel where Christ is more emphatic about what he's saying than about the real presence of himself, of his body and blood in the bread that he offers at the Last Supper. And he even prior to that, he's talking about unless you eat my body and drink my blood, and people are horrified by this. I mean, you can imagine the shockingness of that statement, and many people leave. And he doesn't equivocate. He turns to his apostles and disciples and says, will you leave me too? You're not going to change the teaching. So that caused scandal at the time. It continues to cause scandal, with modern day Protestants. But he's very emphatic. If you're going to be honest about reading the words of the gospel as they appear and the words of Christ as they appear, I don't see how you have any freedom to believe anything other than the real presence of Christ in the sacrament.
One thing I truly deeply appreciate about the Catholic Church is that, with all of the, I suppose, hundreds of heresies that have been established since the days of the early fathers and Irenaeus and even to the present day, there still exists a wide, I suppose, if you can call it, diversity. I know that word has been so abused these days, but true diversity within the faithful, not just regionally or nationally. There's even belief systems and philosophies too. As you mentioned, there are certain quarrels between the Dominicans and the Franciscans and all the orders out there, but there can be differences between, say, Saint Augustine and Saint Thomas, and of course between Chesterton and Belloc, amongst others. So, what is the element that maintains this wonderful diversity of the faithful?
Well, Chesterton speaks somewhere about the walls of a playground. And he says that reality, that basically because of the reality of the dreadful reality of the fall, the fact that we are concupiscent, that we have a tendency towards sin. And again, backstep a bit, Dostoevsky and Alexander Solzhenitsyn and others, have spoken about the battle of good and evil. The battle between good and evil takes place in each individual human heart, right? So each of us is a battleground. Each of us has our own civil war going on. And that's between the two aspects of who we are. The Imago Dei, we're made in the image of God, which means we're never, as Augustine says, we remain restless until we rest in God, because we're made in his image. We're designed to desire him, right? So without that desire being fulfilled, we're going to remain frustrated and unhappy. But what makes us frustrated and unhappy is the other aspect of us thinks that by doing what we want instead of what we should do, right? Really ultimately, love is to sacrifice ourselves for the beloved, even if the beloved is our enemy, right? Love is to sacrifice ourselves to the beloved. Pride is to sacrifice others for the self, right? And ultimately, that's the battle between in our human heart is between those two desires. One is to sacrifice ourselves for others, which requires suffering, and the other is to sacrifice others to ourselves. We do what we want and suffer the consequences. So this battle, that's where Chesterton says, well, that means that the human society is like, it's a civil war. But he says the walls of a playground. So if you imagine humanity is on the top of a precipice, and all around there's an abyss, a drop, thousands of feet. It's deadly. Said once you build a wall around the playground, a fence, to stop people falling over the edge, then you can play freely within it. Without that wall, everyone's huddling towards the middle because everyone's scared of falling over the edge. So Christian doctrine, Christian dogma, the teachings of the church are that wall. Within that wall, there's plenty of room to play, right? But if you go outside of that wall, you fall off the precipice into error, darkness, sin, ultimately damnation.
And of course, his allegory of the fence or the wall, as you put it, applies a lot to what the Reformation has brought forth. Of course, Martin Luther, envisioned that everyone would have their own interpretation and reading of Scripture, and therefore the priesthood of all believer would contain all kinds of thinking. But what it results is denominations after denominations of various degrees of extremism, and I would say orthodoxy, to the extent that it's much more intolerable than the Catholic Church itself.
I mean, what I sometimes say about the consequences of the Protestant Reformation, it was an explosion of faith in the literal sense of the word. An explosion means that you start with one thing, right? It's one whole thing that's not broken. It explodes into fragments, right? So instead of having the one holy Catholic Church, right, if you break away from that, you have this explosion of fragments that not just get smaller, but they get further away from the center. That's what an explosion does, right? It fragments and disperses. And that's exactly what we've seen happening, this explosion of faith in the bad sense of the word since the Protestant Reformation, where we got all these fragments moving further and further away from any authentic understanding of Christianity.
Now, speaking of the Reformation, one of the important figures of that movement is England's own Henry the Eighth. Sorry, Henry the Eighth. For his in defense of the seven sacraments, he was given the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, which is, in hindsight, how ironic it is. But the second Englishman to have received that title is Chesterton. So when you compare Chesterton and King Henry VIII, who is more deserving of that title?
Well, no doubt, of course, that the latter. I mean, it was ironic that the English media were outraged when Pope Pius XI bestowed that tribute on Chesterton, describing him as the Fidei Defensor, the defender of the faith, because they said this is a title reserved for Henry VIII. There's a real irony there, because who bestowed the title upon Henry VIII? The Pope, right? And because of Henry's defense of the seven sacraments of the church, specifically against Martin Luther. And so we have to understand here that there were three reformations, and if we don't understand that there were three reformations in the 16th century, we're not understanding history, because you have the Protestant Reformation, it's Luther and Calvin, etc., centered on the continent, right? Germany, Switzerland, France. And then you have the English Reformation, which is basically King Henry VIII ripping the Catholic Church away from the English people against their will, and it's basically it's the secular nationalization of religion. And what Henry VIII does is establish a state religion where he is the head of the church, right? This is very different from Protestantism. So you have these two distinct reformations. And then the third Reformation is the Catholic, sometimes called the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And of course, it is a Counter-Reformation in one sense, because it is countering both of those other reformations. But it's also an authentic Catholic reformation of the church, because you have these wonderful new orders emerging. So the Jesuits, for instance, and they go out and evangelize the world and come back to England, by the dozen to be martyred. But you also have the reform of movements like the Carmelites by St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. So you have this authentic renewal, and then the reinvigoration of the Mass through the shall we say the spread of the Tridentine Mass across Christendom. And we have to understand, you mentioned about diversity. This is very important. The Church did not ban other manifestations of the Mass. But what the church said is that it has to be at least 100 years old. In other words, it has to predate the Reformation. And this was necessary because the Lutherans what their services was very superficially similar to the Mass. The Anglican Church, the new state religion in England, at least at first, manifested itself very similar to the Mass. So people were confused. What is the holy sacrifice of the Mass? So the church said, well, this is the standard. If you have older manifestations, such as in England, the Sarum Rite, right, which was a Catholic rite that was basically the one mostly used in England prior to the Reformation, that's absolutely still allowed. But if there's any doubt, if anything's under 100 years old, the Tridentine Mass, the Roman Mass, the Mass that's celebrated in Rome, is the actual Mass which unites the church, solidifies the church, with one, lex oriendi, lex credendi, right? That one law of prayer, one law of belief.
Yes. Yeah. So picking up on where King Henry VIII left off, how would you defend the seven sacraments?
I would defend the seven sacraments on the basis that they have been defined by the mystical body of Jesus Christ. We have to understand what is the church. And this is very important, by the way, because we mustn't fall into the error of thinking the church is a human institution, right, that's in time and place. The Catholic Church is the mystical body of Jesus Christ. It's both human and divine. The largest part of the church is the church triumphant in heaven, which does not exist in time at all, of which the majority of the members are probably angelic and not human. This is the church triumphant. The part of the church of which we are a part is called the church militant. That is the church at war with the powers of the world. We are in the midst of a battle, of a war between the mystical body of Jesus Christ on the one hand and his enemy and enemies on the other. So all we have to do is to be good and faithful servants and warriors of Christ for our tour of active service, our duty as soldiers of Christ, which is metaphorically 70 years and 10, right? 70 or so years if we live the full length. We might die younger, we might live longer than that, but ultimately it's a relatively short period of time in the scheme of things that we are called to be fighting the good fight in the church militant for the purpose of, and for the only purpose of, achieving entry into the church triumphant heaven. The whole of human life is nothing but the quest for heaven. So as long as we understand that and understand that everything the church is doing is pointing to heaven, pointing to the triumph of Christ, then we can keep focused on that and not get sidetracked and distracted by worldly things that undermine the strength of our faith.
Yes. I think one of the most important church documents and still very controversial to the modern world is Humanae Vitae, Paul VI's encyclical, which affirms the sanctity and dignity of human life. And of course, Chesterton saw that that particular idea was being eroded in his own days. He famously opposed eugenics, and he wrote a lot about the killing of infants. And I suppose in Chesterton's view, is the church's position in regards to the modern world always has to be oppositional in certain aspects, like the dignity of human life, for example?
Yes, I mean, the world and the worldly. I mean, this is enemy territory. That this is not the place of victory. This is the place of struggle. So, as Chesterton said, we don't want a church that will move with the world. We want a church that will move the world. And this is the crucial distinction, because there are two spirits we can serve, right? One is heretical and the other is orthodox. We can either serve the zeitgeist or the Heiligergeist, right? The spirit of the age or the Holy Spirit. We can't serve both, right? So if we're gonna follow the spirit of the age instead of the Holy Spirit, we're going to become heretics. We're going to actually stop teaching and practicing what Christ has commanded that we preach and practice. So if we don't stay true to the Holy Spirit, we will succumb to the seductions of the spirit of the age. So that's always the thing we have in mind. Are we serving the zeitgeist or the Heiligergeist?
Yes. And I think going back to our pre-conversion days when we're both like very politically convicted, in some ways, the a return to faith is a renunciation of like a certain politicization of the world.
Absolutely. What it is a recentering, right? Instead of this fragmentation, because of course the explosion of faith we talk about with the Protestant Reformation ends up being so far from the center that it's not no longer even Christian, and that so atheism, that this neo-atheism, is a consequence of the Reformation, right? This breaking away from the centrality of truth towards all sorts of wacky, extreme ideas. So being authentically true to the truths of the gospel as taught by the mystical body of Jesus Christ, the church, is to basically stay focused on the reality at the heart of things, which is first of all God, and then men made in the image of God, which, coming back full circle to Humana Vitae, if we forget that we made in the image of God, that we forget the dignity of the human person, and if we forget the dignity of the human person, we end up with systemic infanticide, through abortion. We end up with systemic euthanasia, where basically the only people that will be allowed to live the way culture's going will be either those who have had lived good, loving lives, raising children who will look after them when they're old, so the traditional family, or the rich. Everybody else is going to be terminated. If you're sick and don't have the money to pay for it, and you have no one to look after you, right? You'll just be switched off. You'll be injected with some chemical, and you'll be killed. So once we forget the dignity of the human person, this is what as the heart of Pope Paul VI's Humana Vitae. We forget the dignity of the human person, the dignity of human life. We end up creating monsters and the monstrous societies where we terminate the weak. It's always the weakest that are the victims of this so-called self-empowerment of pride.
Yes, and of course, Lewis said the same thing when he said in Mere Christianity that once you are a Christian, the entire world is basically enemy territory, and you're in some respects behind enemy lines. Now, to what extent did our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ aware and reacted to being behind enemy lines, so to speak, in first century Roman occupied Judea?
That's a great question. I think one thing you have to be very aware of, and so we don't make the mistake, we mustn't become Manichaeans, right, and believe that God's creation is evil, right? when we talk about the world, we talk about human sin and demonic power, and particularly human sinfulness cooperating with demonic power. That's worldliness, that's secularism, that's where the evil is. But if I look out the window to my right here and I see a bank of beautiful green trees, right, basking in sunlight, that's God's creation. So that's why the inseparability of goodness, truth, and beauty. Right. So I think, for instance, when Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he is saying, "I am the good, the true, and the beautiful." Right. The way of goodness. Right. The truth of reason, and the life, which is beauty. In other words, it's not just biological life. This is a mystical, deeper, transcendental life, which we talk about beauty. So the stars in the sky, right? What they are alive with the presence of God. And insofar as we see the beauty of the stars, we are alive with the beauty of God, because we are now in communion. God's creation being glorious, we through his grace, seeing the glory of it, and lifting up our minds and hearts, which is a definition of prayer, in praise of the beauty of the cosmos, is something which is at the heart of reality. So when I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? This is Jesus, and that's an entirely positive message, right? Christians, don't need to go through. Yes, we are in enemy territory, but we mustn't act like our enemies. We mustn't succumb to hatred. We need to respond to hatred with love, with goodness, truth, and beauty, with virtue, with reason, and with being alive to the beauty of the cosmos in which we find ourselves, and giving praise for that, and trying to get other people to open their eyes that they may see it too.
Now, I'd like to end on Chesterton's greatest work, The Everlasting Man, which in the course you point out that it was a response slash rebuttal to H.G. Wells's attempt at chronicling human history, the outline of history. That's the title. So, and Chesterton's central claim is that the arrival of Christ is the event that history of the world should be centralized upon, whereas Wells's picture of history is an ever changing progress that I suppose in some ways kind of disregards the arrival of Christ. So tell me more about the differences between these two views of history.
Yeah, so Belloc's view is the view of the progressives and of the neo-atheists, that humanity is inexorably progressing from a dark, dismal, superstitious past into a golden age in the future, which is going to be ushered in by the physical sciences. Right? That's essentially the understanding of it. I should say, by the way, just H.G. Wells himself, he lived just long enough to see science, physical sciences being used, especially to make weapons of mass destruction. So he saw the World War II and the new weapons there. He saw genocide. He saw the bombing of cities, and ultimately he saw the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with all of these progressive weapons of mass destruction. And his final book was The Mind at the End of Its Tether, where he realized that his own creed was a false creed, and that there was no golden age in the future. But what we now have unleashed through the power of science is the power to destroy each other on a scale undreamed of prior to this. So Wells himself basically turns away from that creed. But you're correct. What Chesterton's point is that the whole of history points to God's presence within it, and God's presence within it ultimately is his incarnation, and that the whole of history prior to that, if you like, is converging on that moment. So we have, for instance, that the Jews theologically have progressed. So the later books of the Old Testament, such as the book of Isaiah, are prophesying the coming of a Messiah. So they're being ripened for the expectation of the coming of Christ. And then the same thing with Athens. So that's Jerusalem, if you like, but Athens, with this golden age of Greek philosophy, with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, have come to an understanding that that ultimately at the core of the cosmos is not chaos, no, not millions of gods and demons, creating something chaotic at the heart of things. At the heart of things, there has to be a unity, and that unity necessitates there being ultimately one God. And if there are other so-called gods, in other words, other so-called supernatural beings, they are above the one God is more powerful than all of them put together. Even Homer saw this, by the way, in the Iliad, that God says, so Zeus, the father of the gods, says to all the other gods, all the other supernatural beings, if we were to have a tug of war, and all of you, all of the other gods were on one end of the string, the rope, and Zeus is on the other, Zeus would win, and the gods do not dispute that. They do not argue with him. They accept that. So even going back before the Greek philosophers, to the great storytellers, Homer, we're getting this understanding that there has to be an omnipotent, ultimately omniscient, and omnipresent divinity. So, so if you like the goodness, truth, and beauty again, theology, right? This understanding of what is good in the light of our understanding of God, of theology. Jerusalem is being ripened through the prophets to accept and embrace the coming of the Messiah. The true reason philosophers are coming to expect that God, when God reveals himself, he's going to be as a one omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient being. And then the truth, right? The way of beauty, the storytellers, the myth makers are also coming to this understanding of the coming of Christ. And so Chesterton in The Everlasting Man speaks about that. He speaks about the fact that the story of the gospel, in particular the story of the incarnation at Bethlehem, that the shepherds represent the myth makers, the storytellers, the wise men represent the philosophers, and of course he is the fulfillment of the desire of the Jews. So that all of this comes together in the incarnation of Christ. So the whole of history prior to it points to it. The incarnation of Christ and in his life, death, and resurrection baptizes human history and makes sense of it. And everything after that is baptized with that presence.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Joseph Pearce, for being on the program.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.